Welcome to the So What from BCG, the podcast that explores the big ideas shaping business, the economy, and society. I'm Georgie Frost. In this episode, as companies around the world develop and deploy AI, Asia Pacific is no longer following Silicon Valley's lead. Instead, innovation is happening in parallel. So what does it mean if AI no longer has a single centre of gravity? Well, joining me is Jeff Walters from BCGX, who leads the tech and digital advantage for Asia Pacific. Jeff, what's your so what?
Innovation is happening here in Asia, whether you're paying attention or not. So corporate leaders, business leaders need to understand this region just as well as their own or Silicon Valley.
If you're based in the West, it's easy to miss how quickly AI adoption has accelerated across Asia Pacific. Companies there are deploying AI faster, and workers are often more open to using it. For businesses that still assume innovation flows one way, that shift matters. Jeff, welcome. Jeff, what's been happening in Asia Pacific over the last decade when it comes to tech and AI adoption and development? What are you seeing firsthand?
Well, look, companies here have always been ambitious. Companies here are always moving fast. But I actually would bet that we might have a higher percentage of companies here which, 2.5, 3 years ago, when we first had that generative AI boom, really decided to jump in the deep end quickly, saying, look, I fundamentally recognize this transformed how my industry is going to work and how my business needs to work. So I think we saw a rapid acceleration of innovation out here a few years ago.
Jeff, it's been a long time since I've lived in Asia Pacific, about 20 years. I guess it's changed quite a lot.
It's been actually about 20 years that I've been here, coming originally from, the Silicon Valley area, right? And actually, when I first moved, it was to, Beijing in 2006. I had this angst, which was, my gosh, I'm so used to being deep in the early Amazon and CD Now and some companies that we've probably forgotten about, when I came out to Asia. And then I thought, I don't necessarily have those things here when I was in China or other parts of the region. And so it was this kind of FOMO, with this fear of missing out of that which was happening right in the West. And now actually I have a reverse FOMO in that context, like when I'm in Shanghai, right? So I can wake up in the morning, I press like 3 clicks on my phone, right? And by the time I've showered and gotten downstairs in my hotel, my coffee is hot in 20 minutes, in a little locker that I open with a QR code. And so actually I feel like anything, from a consumer perspective, anything I would need, product or service, is literally in your hands in like 30 minutes. When I show up in San Francisco or Palo Alto, I think, where are all those services that I'm used to, right? So I think things have really changed, and that kind of significant foundation of innovation in a really inherently, digital context that which everyone lives, I think is a real foundation of why we've seen so much acceleration here in the past few years.
But is there a general picture as to why innovation has driven so fast?
I mean, first off, if you take many of our big markets, whether it be India, China, Indonesia, and others, they are intensely competitive. Not that there isn't competition everywhere, but this is, the heavyweight boxing ring. And so therefore, every company that is growing fast or is a leader today got there through kind of a street fight, right? Of really intense, ambitious competitors. So there's always a sense of, if I'm not moving to the next thing, then my competitor is and I'm dead, right? And I think, that permeates a lot of leadership in Asia Pacific. And then you put on top of that, right, in many of our markets, a very young population that is oftentimes very willing to try new things. I think, we see in some of our survey data, for example, a real openness to the benefits of AI, right? Much outweighing the concerns or anxieties about what AI will do to my job or whatnot. That relative positivism is stronger out here than we see in the West.
Now, I want to dig into a little bit more about the attitudes of leaders and workers in parts of Asia compared perhaps with those in Europe or US, because a lot of the conversations that we have around AI are, shall I say, tinted with a bit of pessimism, particularly about jobs, etc., and adoption and privacy and all of those things.
Yes. I mean, I think there's an inherent optimism. which actually is related to a simple question of, do you think your children will live better lives than you did? Which in many of our markets in Asia is actually, a higher percentage of people would say that than in many of the very developed Western markets, right? So there's that optimism that starts number one. By the way, it's interesting because if you look across many of our markets, the sense of optimism around the power of AI is high. The question of, do I use AI in my daily life and in my work, is about 10 points higher in Asia than we see in the West, right? So that's played out in terms of what people are using. The sense of anxiety about it being bad for society or being bad for me is in general lower in most of our markets. That being said, and this has been true everywhere in the world, as people use these tools, realize how powerful they are, they do also have a concern about, my specific job today might go away. And actually, despite the optimism in Asia, there's still a high percentage of people that say, I think the kind of job that I do may transform or disappear in the coming years. So I don't think it's a blindness. It's not blinders on in terms of, this is not changing work. No, it is changing work, but that's going to be beneficial. And the benefits are outweighing some of the negatives.
You talk to CEOs all the time. What are leaders telling you at the moment?
Not everything is completely different in Asia. It's only a mid-single digits % of companies that have truly transformed with AI. It's still 5, 6, 7%. And that number is pretty consistent in most of the markets we look at. It's pretty consistent in the East, pretty consistent in the West. So therefore, I think what CEOs here, as well as CEOs everywhere, are looking for is like, look, I hear a lot of talk about AI. I see all of my young and excited people that we're talking about in my organization, right, are adopting things. But show me the money. When is this going to lead to, fundamental, I think, differences in how I operate? But, I think what has been happening as we've progressed through 25 and now into 26 is more and more CEOs starting to recognize, okay, there is a bit of a formula or a playbook, which I need, which is top-down, aspirational driven, big, hairy change transformation. And I'm going to have to drive that in my organization, if I'm going to want to, see the money.
I want to talk about what I intimated at the start, which was about the fact that in the past, Asia Pacific followed Silicon Valley on AI. Is that fair? How has that changed? And why does that matter?
Let's remember, over 25 years ago, that the economies of Asia were a completely different size, right? I mean, China wasn't the second largest economy in the world at that point. India was a tiny market and really just embarking on its overall kind of a period of economic growth. And just in that context, the amount of technology that was in the hands of office workers, of consumers, lagged by years, right? And in many cases, decades. And now, when I talk to leaders, there is a sense that will not happen and that people will not let that happen because all of the foundations that are necessary to, get business benefit from these technologies are in place in most of our markets. We've got smartphones in the hand of most of the consumers in pretty much every market in Asia Pacific. We have, most companies on a strong hardcore or, core tech foundation already. Automation is here in our factories already. So honestly, if you talk to an Indian CEO, you talk to a Chinese CEO, talk to an Indonesian CEO, many of them behind closed doors would say, can be more ambitious than our peers in the West. So I think, that's really, I would think about this wave being one that happens in parallel, right, as opposed to in sequence.
How significant do you think is the rise of non-US tech stacks, including Chinese open source models? And I guess, what does that mean for companies operating across multiple regions?
I think we've seen it last year with the so-called DeepSeek moment, the sense that frontier models can only come, or foundation models can only come from the West. That image was shattered. And, what we're always counseling our clients is to say, look, you're working backwards from a business problem. And then you're going to say, from a technology perspective, which tools do I pull out of my toolbox? Well, that toolbox can have tools from many countries now. What's very different today is, many of these underlying technologies are also technologies of national interest. We will probably see more export restrictions. We see sensitivities, particularly, certainly at the hardware level and particularly even at the model level. And what that means is that business leaders have to think more proactively around, well, if I'm not sitting in the United States or I'm not sitting in certain markets, might I have more difficulty accessing certain technologies in the future? So it's two things, really, it's like, am I looking in the right places for what's best in breed? And second, am I managing some of the risks that now happen now that geopolitics and technology are so deeply intertwined?
It's interesting you talk about, am I looking at what's best in breed? Because is it fair to say there's a bit of an information asymmetry going on here?
If there is an interesting talk from one of the AI luminaries, right, from Silicon Valley, or any other, there's a new keynote from Jensen Huang somewhere, that the highlights and the tidbits are there with Chinese subtitles or translated in Chinese in the Chinese ecosystem instantaneously, right? So if I'm a full stack engineer, right, or an entrepreneur sitting in China, I know everything that's going on in China, and I know everything that's going on in the West. I don't think that's always the case, right? For those similar equivalent folks in the West. Now, I think compared to 10 years ago, there is a better awareness of the amount of innovation that's coming out from, I talk about China a lot, but it will be from other places as well, too.
How would you recommend going about changing that? Is there a blueprint to follow for companies?
You're never going to lift and shift and just copy something that's happening in one of these Asia markets, right, over to your own. Just like, if we go back 15, 20 years, Western tech companies that try to lift and shift their model into China certainly didn't do so well. I think it's about inspiration. I think it's about finding plays that will rhyme, right, but not necessarily need to be copied, right, into my own market. But there's a few practical things. Have some meetings here. Come here. Right? That's relatively straightforward. Immerse yourself in the ecosystem a little bit. I think we have a lot of sensitivity that is driven by geopolitical concerns, but that sensitivity should not get in the way of awareness. That's actually the simplest thing.
Which areas in particular do you see Asia Pacific moving especially quickly on AI?
There are some places where Asia, will inherently lead because of the nature of our economies, the nature of our consumers. So especially when you take some of our massive markets like China and India, they are now mobile first, what we call quick commerce first, meaning, with the structure of costs, I can have products delivered very, very quickly. My primary interface is on mobile phone. They are countries of multiple languages. Hence, I actually think if I had to make a prediction, places that would lead in voice-driven commerce, voice-driven agentic commerce, I would look for innovation in India. There's a lot of languages in India, right? So I think anything that's in kind of that consumer tech milieu, right, we would expect a lot of innovation coming out of here. On the complete flip side of that, right, let's not also forget that Asia Pacific represents probably half, if not more, of the world's manufacturing value add, despite all the complexity that tariffs have brought. So you will find the most advanced dark factories in the world, particularly in China and now increasing in other parts of Asia. So the applications of AI in manufacturing here, I think, are moving fastest because the foundations and the scale are so significant. And also, that's not a wave that is also coming up, which is robotics. We're hearing a lot about robotics right now. Let's think about where those robots are made. And if I had to pick a place which might have all the preconditions for the that software hardware fusion that is necessary for AI plus robotics, well, Shenzhen is one of those places, right? So I think manufacturing and robotics and what's coming up in physical AI, I would expect a lot of leadership out of Asia.
You mentioned dark factories. Jeff, could you just explain what dark factories are?
Well, it's actually dark if you go inside. And why do you not need the lights on? Or sometimes we call them lights off factories. It's because there are not humans doing many things. So we don't need anyone to see. So, Asia is the place of, I would say, the most advanced factories in the world. Also, you can find some of the least advanced factories in the world still here as well, too. Right. But this is really, I'd say, ironically, the lighthouse for dark factories.
Where and what do you see pulling ahead in the next 10 years?
Yeah. Here's where, we've been talking about Asia, as a monolith, but it certainly is not. And so our markets are indeed different. If I were to, do a bit of a tier list, right, and say, okay, so where are companies moving the fastest in really transforming their business models and everything soup to nuts with AI? It is certainly China. It is certainly India. No questions about that. There is a next tranche, which in many cases, leading companies that move very fast. You'd be surprised at how fast some companies in the Philippines are moving. Singapore is becoming a very important innovation hub, not just for the region, but for the world. And actually, many companies across Southeast Asia are moving fast. Taiwan, an important market, particularly in the semiconductor and the manufacturing value chain. All those things that I talked about in terms of now the applications of AI on top of manufacturing is really top of mind with Taiwanese companies, and they're moving very quickly. And that has also, I think, really moved over to South Korea in the past year or so, where maybe there was a little bit of reticence 2 years ago, but companies are beginning to move fast. Now, not everyone is racing ahead. While there are leaders in every market, on average, and our survey results show this, companies moving a bit less fast in Australia and companies moving a bit less fast in Japan as well too. So we do have quite some variation as you take this little tour around Asia.
Why do you think for those particular countries?
One of the things that we will always hit upon is driving, impact with AI is fundamentally change and transformation. And it's fundamentally about a willingness to make it happen. And if I look at the corporate cultures in some of these markets, where if I have a mix of a bit of conservatism, right? If I have a mix of maybe a bit less dynamic competitive structures in some industries. And I have a mix of, and frankly, this is also important, somewhat more aging white collar populations, which actually does make a difference in this. Those things can combine together in different ways, right, to lead to some slowness. Now, that being said, we're talking about averages, we're talking about medians, but you can find, companies moving at warp speed in any one of these markets.
We've both mentioned a couple of times about this not being a monolith and autonomous block, but it actually has lots of different parts to it. But do you think it's fair to say that now and in the coming years, there would be looking less to the West and more to each other, and in so doing, create, a tighter union based around AI?
Tighter union may be pushing it, right? Because if I'm sitting in Jakarta, right? If I'm sitting in Singapore, if I'm sitting in Shanghai, and I'm doing that, what some companies like to do is like, well, what's the best practice and who's moving fastest in my industry, in my sector, in my segment? The first reaction is not to look to the West, right? There will be, back to that information asymmetry point, there will be an understanding of what's happening there, for sure, right? And that's a bit like table stakes. The interesting conversations, it's what's that company across the street, or what's that company, 500, 1,000 kilometers away doing, right? I think that already is what the conversation is.
Do you have an example of a company that is particularly impressing you?
One of the things that I, often share with colleagues is, gosh, you might take an industry like banking, for example, and say, well, if I want to really understand how to transform a bank with AI, do I have to look to New York? Do I have to look to London? I will tell you, what's happening in Mumbai would blow your mind. What's happening in some markets in Southeast Asia would blow your mind. And I think some companies there are probably a few laps ahead of what some of those traditional, like leaders in financial institutions are already doing. If you think about the core functions of a bank, whether it be, how my wealth managers operate, how I manage and develop my technology, which is a core function of banks because, banking products are essentially instantiated in technology. If I think about how I manage my branches and upskill my people there, probably the companies that started first were out here in Asia, especially after we had the first Gen AI boom, right? And then that created the foundations for them to very quickly move to agentic operating models, where that is not just a word that people go up and say on stage because it's the buzzword of 2025, but is actually reality. So I think that in banking is certainly an area where I see leaders here. I think manufacturing is another place. I mean, we have the most advanced factories in the world, full stop, in Asia Pacific. And because we have the most advanced factories in the world, that means they're highly automated. And because they're highly automated, that means the work and the competitive advantage of a factory is knowledge work. It's how do I manage these complicated machines? How do I string these machines together and make them operate? How do I squeeze the last little decimal points of efficiency out of already optimized processes? And the companies that were already ahead of this were in Asia, and certainly the places where AI applied to the knowledge work of factories, which is the big frontier where we can unlock value today. It's happening faster here than probably anywhere else. By the way, not everything let's be clear, Asia doesn't always lead in everything, right? One difference, in a place I don't always look to Asia is if I fundamentally have a cost or overheads problem. This is where we see many companies in the West are saying, like, how could I solve this with AI?
Jeff, what muscle do you think that leaders need to build? What muscles do you think leaders need to build wherever they are in the world?
It's interesting because we talked about patterns and like, okay, so what determines if a company is going to move fast? Is the population young or old, right? What's my corporate, competitive environment like, et cetera? I actually think all of those as predictor variables for a given company pale in comparison to the leadership mindset. And the leadership mindset is the fundamental difference between the leaders and the laggards. What are the elements of that leadership mindset that create that speed? It is, number one, an intuitive understanding that AI fundamentally changes knowledge work in a way that we are just barely beginning to comprehend. Hence, fundamentally changes how you operate as a business, because most what businesses do is knowledge work to manage processes. And then, therefore, its second is the understanding that I need to set big, hairy, ambitious goals. I need to look at transforming my core functions, whatever they may be, in whatever industry I am. And finally, I think there's another pattern that we've now seen, which is if you take one of those core functions and are really going to reshape it and transform it, if you haven't reorganized the team, you haven't done anything. And, so that is the interesting litmus test. We can all talk about our use cases in whatever forum, but if I actually haven't reorganized a function, maybe even my entire company, started bringing in and relying on fundamentally different skill sets than I had before, then I probably haven't done anything yet. And I think, that's another realization that, the leading leaders we see in the region certainly have in their mindset.
You've covered the so what. Now it's time for the now what. What are the next immediate steps that leaders can take?
I think number one is you have to be inspired by the ambition level and the speed with which companies can move in Asia. And, that speed should be bottled and brought to whatever market you're sitting in, right? No matter how old and staid my industry is. But I do struggle to see any industry that isn't going to fundamentally transform. And it's just a question of whether the leaders are going to, really tackle it now, right? Or wait to be outclassed by one of their competitors, and maybe a competitor from our region out here in Asia.
Jeff, thank you so much. And to you for listening. If you want to read the report that Jeff co-authored, AI at Work, is Asia Pacific leading the way? Just follow the link in the show notes.
Thank you.